Welcome to this panel on translation flows in Asia. My name's Kate Griffin. I'm the International Programme Director at the British Centre for Literary Translation, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel. Our speakers this afternoon are on my left, Anna Holmwood, Deborah Smith, Alvin Pang, and Michael Emmerich. To start off, rather than me just reading out their bios to you, which you can read in the brochure for yourself, I thought it would be better if I asked them each to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their own translation work. So maybe Anna, if you want to start.
Hello. Yep. I'm Anna Holmwood. I translate from Chinese and from Swedish, but I suppose Chinese is the one that's relevant in this context. I also work as a literary agent selling translation rights into and out of the Chinese markets. That is, we represent Chinese authors, and we also sell the rights to foreign books into Taiwan and mainland China.
Hi, I'm Deborah Smith. I'm a freelance translator from Korean into English. I do literary fiction. I'm also studying a PhD in contemporary Korean literature at the moment. So I've been translating sort of in conjunction with that for about a year now. I've recently finished my first novel translation and have been pitching that to various people here, and hoping to do more translations in the future in conjunction with Korea being market focus here at the London Book Festival next year, and a lot of other exciting initiatives.
Hi, I'm Alvin, mainly based in Singapore. I've got one book published by ARC in the UK this past summer. But I've also been quite active back home in Singapore as an editor, anthologist, curator, and quite recently as a publisher of work primarily in translation. I did a fair amount of translations. There are 4 major languages in Singapore that we work in: English, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. And so there's a lot of work to be done, although not enough is being done in those areas, so we're trying to promote that. I personally have translated some work from Italian and Chinese as well.
My name is Michael Emmerich. I teach Japanese literature and translate mostly contemporary Japanese fiction, some modern Japanese fiction into English. I've worked with authors ranging from Yasunari Kawabata to Genichiro Takahashi, Banana Yoshimoto, Hiromi Kawakami, etc.
That's great. Thank you all very much. The title of the panel is Translation Flows in Asia, but obviously we're going to be focusing primarily on the 4 countries represented here: China, Korea, Singapore, and Japan. Translation flows is a very broad question, so I thought a broad issue, so I thought I'd start off with very broad questions for the panelists. I will try and allow a bit of time at the end for any questions. The first thing I wanted everybody to talk about is basically what are the literary trends within your country, what are people reading, and then what gets translated, and what's, how is what influences translation choices, who decides what gets translated, and what is the role of institutes and organizations. And it's a very open question, but I thought we'd start off with that.
Right, it was a huge question, I guess, because I work with mainland China and Taiwan. I guess I would emphasize that actually the reality is that in those 2 markets, people are reading quite different things. In terms of that, in Taiwan, there's, I'd say, more translation of contemporary big sellers that are selling around the world. Things are translated more quickly there than they are in mainland China. So everything from kind of paranormal romance YA to bigger, American titles, Freedom, John Franzen, all that. I mean, those are translated into mainland China as well. But there's a very broad range of things being bought by Taiwanese publishers. I think in mainland China, it's a little bit slower for those titles to reach the market, and there's still more emphasis on big classics. So You know, the biggest hit in recent years has been 100 Years of Solitude. It's been selling millions and millions and millions. So it's still a kind of, there's a somewhat of a lag, I think, in that market compared to with Taiwan in terms of the kind of most recent hits. And then in terms of domestic kind of Chinese language writing, there's some genres which we will recognize. You know, there's love stories, historical fiction, there's crime, not so much. There are a lot of non-fiction is particularly strong, especially in mainland China, a lot of business books and things like that. And then, of course, there are things which do particularly well in those markets which we don't really read so much of here, like essays, contemporary essays and things like that. So that's a sort of very brief introduction.
And for the Korean market, somewhat similar to China and most other countries, in fact, Koreans read the same broad range of genre titles that we do anywhere else: crime fiction, romance, literature. Although one thing that often strikes me is that there isn't the same stark divide between genres in the Korean market that there is, for example, in English language publishing. I attended a translation workshop last year focusing on science fiction, and we translated stories from about 9 or 10 authors, and none of those authors were science fiction authors. They were all considered writers of literary fiction. These were stories that they'd written which happened to have SF elements, often dystopian, but a lot of their other works were completely different from that. There are a couple of sort of perennially favorite genres among Korean readers: historical novels dealing with Korean history, sort of generally nationalistic subjects seen as being of particular interest to Korea. Also, Korean readers, I would say, are generally more receptive to what we might think of as sentimental or sort of melodramatic qualities, not just in literature, in Korean dramas, which are incredibly popular throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia. Many of you may have read Please Look After Mother by Shin Kyung-suk. Very well received in the US and the UK, actually, but possibly seen by some people as slightly sentimental. Some people did castigate it in the press for that, actually, but it's not so frowned upon in Korea than it would be here, perhaps. In terms of translation, also similar to what Anna mentioned in the Chinese context, traditionally classics have been a big focus from European languages, so English, French, German, Russian. A lot of books are published from China and Japan because of the geographical closeness and their historical ties. But most excitingly, recently, there's been a growing trend of translations from smaller languages and Korean literature being translated into what we would consider minority languages, such as Lithuanian, Vietnamese. There are novels that have been translated into these languages which haven't appeared in English translation, though these are generally by quite well thought of authors who've been translated into maybe other larger languages such as Spanish. And Kate mentioned the role that institutions play, governmental or otherwise, and we were just discussing pre-panel the role that LTI Korea play with getting Korean translations out into the world and generally promoting Korean literature around the world. I know we have a few representatives from LTI Korea here today, so we would all like to say thank you.
I had the privilege of being a guest at the Seoul Young Writers Festival that's organized by LTI Korea some years back, and they are fabulous folks. Go get to know them. Singapore is a really small community, obviously, about 5-6 million people, but we are incredibly voracious readers. And because we are multicultural and multilingual society, essentially it doesn't make sense to talk about any one market. We've got 4 reading communities, 4 language communities. Everyone reads English because of the administrative system and business system, education systems based in English. And we probably read the same sort of books you do, Swedish thrillers and Harry Potter and so on and so forth. Short story, short fiction is particularly popular in Singapore, particularly urban narratives. I heard a speaker who was here a few hours ago say the same thing, that essentially outside the UK and Europe, short fiction is very bigger than it is here. I would say that's fairly true of where we are as well, certainly for the sort of work that's being produced in English, short fiction, urban narratives. For some reason, poetry in English is doing quite well in Singapore, relatively speaking. I mean, still not going to pay the bills with it, but we sell 1,000, 2,000 for the established poets. In a city of 5 million people, that's not too bad. So that's for English. The Chinese reading community, I think, gets its reading diet, apart from Singaporean writers, it gets its reading diet from the Chinese communities up north. Less so mainland China, although that certainly happens, but certainly places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, provides our reading diet as well. And the Sanwen, which is the literary essay or casual essay, is a big thing in the Chinese reading community. And it's something actually I've been trying to bring into the English language. It's published in the newspapers, for example, but there isn't quite an equivalent form in the English language papers, for example, for the sort of long, reflective literary essay. And I thought that's something that's quite interesting. Microfiction or flash fiction is something that the Chinese literary community in Singapore is also quite big on. There are, I think, 2 microfiction societies in the city as well. And it's a form that, again, doesn't show up as prolifically in the other languages. And people write it partly because people read it. So reading and writing go hand in hand. The Malay reading community, I suppose, draws its readers and writers from the larger Malay world. You're talking about Indonesia with 250 million people, Malaysia as well. And that's a large and largely unexplored world for literature. Very little of it gets translated into English. In fact, I have a Malaysian friend who has specifically set up a publishing house to translate world classics into Malay so that the reading diet of readers in the Malay language would be enriched. There is a current disturbing trend for a lot of the work in the Malay language to be geared towards particularly hardline flavors of Islam. And so cornering the language is cornering the culture, is cornering the society, and that's something that writers and readers sort of push back against. Certainly our writers do that. So it's a different world and a different readership. And Tamil, again, looking to South Asia, South India in particular. So it's almost like we have 4 reading publics and 4 literatures. Very little has been done across the different communities, even in a small country like Singapore. And that's really why there's lots of work for us to do.
It's very tempting to suggest that no one reads anymore in Japan, and just because Japan used to be such a reading culture, and now that's not really the case anymore. But still, of course, it's an incredibly diverse place, despite the fact that it seems like it's not an incredibly diverse place, and there are people reading all kinds of things. So the question of what people are reading is sort of impossible to answer. So I'm not going to answer it exactly. But I will sort of answer it by just making a few observations about the kind of structure, the way that the literary field is structured. Literary magazines also are not really read as much as they used to be anymore. But they're still there, they're still important, they're still a really important venue for kind of cultivating new writing. And there's a really, something that's very interesting about Japanese literary magazines. They publish a lot of really, really bad stuff. Like you'll open up a magazine, you go through, and there'll be just stuff that I've read. I remember there's this one piece I read many years ago that sticks in my mind as being probably the worst thing that I've read in the past 2 decades. Really, like, I couldn't believe that this is something that in high school everybody was said, like, you can't this is dreadful. And it was published in this literary magazine, right? In one of the 4 main literary magazines. And that actually, I think, is wonderful. It sounds sort of bad that you'd have this dreadful, dreadful stuff being published in the major literary magazines. But because you can publish dreadful, dreadful stuff in the major literary magazines, every so often you'll have somebody who's writing this magnificent stuff that's just weird kind of explode like fireworks or something, right? It's sort of like, the literary magazines become this boat that can go out in the river into the middle of nowhere and send up these flares, which, if you think about, say, The New Yorker, I expect that The New Yorker will only publish really good fiction. But I also expect that The New Yorker will publish really good fiction that is really good by a certain kind of definition. So the Japanese literary market, because you have these literary magazines, because you have publishers that are publishing book after book after book by people who are not necessarily established, it allows for a kind of high tolerance for experimental fiction. So I think that's one of the things that really characterizes Japanese writing, is that there's a lot of bad stuff, but because you've got this bad stuff, a lot of weird stuff, and people are more tolerant of it and are able to read weird things. And that kind of goes along with, say, in Korea, you were mentioning the kind of hybridization of different genres. You have the same thing in Japan. So really, kind of fluid boundaries between science fiction, literary fiction, historical novels, and popular. Everything is kind of jumbled up. So that's 2 observations. One, the experimental quality. 2, hybridization about the domestic literary production. In terms of translation, it seems to me that the one thing we could say about the market for translations in Japan is that it's highly, highly structured by star translators. So they're, people who come out and they can, anything that they translate will be a bestseller. There's one translator in particular, Motoyuki Shibata, some of you may have heard of him, who, he'll take a writer, Barry Yorgrau, for instance, or Rebecca Brown are the 2 people who come to mind, who are not necessarily widely known in the English-speaking world, but they're bestsellers in Japan because Shibata translates them. And he was running a literary magazine called Monkey Business for a while, which still exists in English. Unfortunately, it does not exist in Japanese anymore. But he would, be translating stuff that's all in the public domain because it's cheaper. But he'd take, he'd take like Melville, or he'd take, actually he did Salinger, and turn these things into, almost bestsellers, right? Which is something it's hard to imagine happening in the English-speaking world, I think. One other thing that I'll say about the translation market, the question of what are people reading is one question, right? There's also, but it's kind of a misleading question, right? Because you say, what are people reading? Well, you could list up say that the bestsellers in translated fiction, and that wouldn't necessarily tell you anything, because there's the other question, which is, how are they reading them, right? I was in Tokyo just last month, actually, there was a literary festival there, and I was moderating an event that involved Nicole Krauss. And in preparation, I went online and was just looking to see, first of all, what had been translated by Nicole Krauss, and trying to get a sense of how people were reading her. And, her first book is called Man Walks Into a Room. The Japanese translation is called The Absence of Two-Thirds. And there's this wonderful review on Amazon that says, "This isn't science fiction." Well, if she wanted to make this real science fiction, she should have had aliens around, something like that. And, it's not a science fiction book. But there's somebody who's reading in this way, and actually I think that's very important. So the question of, how you'll have all these books being translated, and you could look at them, and depending on the publisher that's publishing them, but depending on how they're being marketed or not marketed, you'll have these things that are being read in a totally different way, or maybe not being read at all, just because you can't kind of break through as easily and say, this should matter to you. Jonathan Safran Foer, for instance, his When Everything is Illuminated came out, it was like a rock being gently lowered into the water. It just vanished. and the rest of the world, everybody was all excited about it, and in Japan it just vanished. I think it has something to do about the fact that people don't care as much or aren't as aware of the Holocaust in Japan as people are here. So.
You've touched on an issue that we were talking about earlier, which is where translations are published and small presses versus large presses, magazines, and also how they're circulated and where they're sold in shops. Maybe that would be something you'd all like to comment on next.
Yeah, well, I guess everyone's aware that probably in the English-speaking world, translation is sort of unusually segregated in the market compared to just about anywhere else in the world. So I think for the Taiwanese and Chinese markets, you'll find you walk into a bookshop, obviously translated fiction is very prominent because any big sellers, so whether it's from a non-fiction Steve Jobs' biography or whether it's Casual Vacancy or whether it's something smaller, they'll be displayed prominently within the bookshop. So from that point of view, I don't think that translated fiction is necessarily segregated. In fact, I would almost say it's the opposite, that you go walk into a bookshop in China or Taiwan and you almost have to go and look for the section which is modern Chinese writers. Yeah. So I find I walk in there and I'm thinking, okay, now where is the Chinese writing? Where's my section for that? So I think that in many ways that it's had that kind of effect that you see the dividing off of Chinese literature as something special and in a special section, and potentially the translated fiction is seen as a kind of more general titles on display. As for who's publishing them, I mean, I think that there's a range of different publishers, but I mean, big publishers are obviously translating the big titles from around the world. So in many ways, it's not the reserve of small presses by any means. It would be almost the opposite. Although I have to say that in China has a tendency to have a few more specialized translation publishing houses like Yilin and Shanghai 99 that predominantly do translated fiction, whereas I think in Taiwan that's sort of less the case.
I certainly think it's a very important point to consider where the translations are being published. It's not enough to simply say that a translation has been published and that's good enough. A lot of what has been published from Korean into English has been published by academic presses, university presses, because that's been seen as the market, people who are students at university studying Korean literature. But there is virtually no sort of cross-fertilization between that and your regular reading public. These university press books, they won't be available in bookstores by and large. They might be available online, but they'll be prohibitively expensive. And so it's really just not reaching the general public. And in terms of the divide between big and small presses, I would say that small presses, we've all heard a lot about them here in the LTC, and it really is to do with who has got the time to focus on publicizing and marketing these books. A lot of the smaller presses, their lists are a lot smaller. Some of them may only publish 3 or 4 books a year. So they're only going to publish books which they really believe in and are passionate about. And also the fact that they don't have, 30 other books coming out in the same month means that they can focus what resources they have on that book, even if in terms of finances, they're not as well set up as a larger publishing house.
A lot of what Anna and Deborah have described about the scene in Korea and Taiwan, Taipei, certainly applies in very similar ways to Singapore. Our larger bookstores like Kinokuniya and Popular are bilingual, not necessarily multilingual. But we do carry the books everyone else reads. So we've got the English books that you would see in Waterstones. We've got the Chinese, mainstream Chinese titles that probably come from Taipei, in fact. And the Singapore literature section would be a small shelf at the back that you have to ask for the key for. I'm being unkind. They are very supportive and have been. But it is true that we receive a lot of work, translated or otherwise, as mainstream. That's the label. So we grew up with Japanese manga that's translated. In fact, I never knew that Doraemon or Xiao Ding Dang was Japanese until I grew up and read, oh, hang on, this is translated stuff. This is part and parcel of our childhoods and continues to be. So it has a profound effect outside, I suppose, Japan on the peoples of my region. I just wanted to point to one interesting project that a friend of mine from Singapore, is now based in Taipei, is running, which I think is very exciting. He runs an online journal dedicated to literary translation, and it's called Asymptote, which is essentially, in mathematical terms, a curve that approaches but doesn't quite meet the parallel, which is a nice metaphor for translation. And it's only 2 years old, but has attracted an amazing range of languages, writers, translations. Anna's, I think, involved in that effort in particular. And it struck me that I'd like to think that spirit of crossing borders, being online, being essentially not bound by frontiers or particular languages, and just putting good work out there for everyone to access and to find, started from little efforts in Singapore, because we're constantly sort of trying to reach beyond our little territory. And there are many other efforts that have been less successful for now, publishing efforts, small presses and so on, but there's a lot of that outward energy, I would say. Yeah. Market remains to be seen.
It feels so dull, doesn't it, to be going in the same order? I think we're going to shake things up at some point. Yeah. Literary magazines, I mentioned literary magazines before. One really interesting thing that's happening in the past few years is that literary magazines in Japan have started publishing more translation. In particular, this one literary magazine called Gunzo started up a kind of collaboration with Granta, and the idea was that they'd be publishing things from Gunzo would go into Granta, and things from Granta would go into Gunzo. In practice, many things from Granta have gone into Gunzo, and not very much from Gunzo has gone into Granta, in large part perhaps because a lot of the stuff is not very good. And then, I think there are other reasons. But my impression is that Granta is, legitimately interested in continuing this relationship, and things will be coming out in the future. But just the fact that, literary magazines have started publishing more translation, I think, is a really interesting trend. Small presses versus big presses came up, and I think this is probably typical of any country that is not largely English-speaking, right? English has become such a dominant language in the world that if you're in some other language, it's quite likely that big presses are going to be translating out of English and then, as a result, out of other languages into whatever language you're writing in. And in Japan, certainly, you've got, the most important translation series. There's like Crest Books at Shinchosha, for instance. Shinchosha is, one of the big publishers. And that's where a lot of the really important translation work is published. And interestingly, there are resources for this, and they have the connections. And a couple of years ago, this translator I mentioned earlier, Motoyuki Shibata, published, believe it or not, a translation of Mason and Dixon. If anybody here has read Mason and Dixon, it's one of those things that, first of all, you can't understand what you read, and is just completely incomprehensible half the time. I was asked to check the translation, and I went through it and didn't check the translation. I was, reading the translation and saying like, oh, so that's what it means. Most of them, sort of, yeah. And Kay, first of all, actually, they didn't pay me to check it, but just the fact that they could, Mason and Dixon is an enormous book. And they published it, without a subsidy. There's no way in hell that you could publish something that long from Japanese in English without a subsidy. Yeah. It's impossible. Even with a subsidy, you need not only a subsidy, but you have to buy a Tesla for the editor of, whoever works, Tesla being this, the new fancy electric car. I don't know if there's or a Porsche would be fine, probably. You have to bribe somebody to actually get the book to be published, because they won't want to publish it even with a subsidy, because long stuff doesn't sell, they say. So I think, it's very important that you have big presses involved. Bookstores came up, and where where translations appear in bookstores. That's also really interesting. Still in Japan, you certainly do not have Japanese fiction tucked away at the back. I think the translated fiction is more likely to be tucked away kind of in the back. But you do have different sections in almost any bookstore you go to. There'll be a section, not frequently you'll have Japanese writers, male and female, separated, not always. That used to be standard. That's kind of vanishing, but hasn't completely vanished. But you definitely have a division between writers who are writing in Japanese and then foreign fiction. So there will be a foreign fiction section, sometimes divided by country or language, but not always, maybe not even usually. And I've always wondered if that's a good thing or a bad thing. There aren't that many bookstores here. I can think of some actually here, I don't know, but in the US, I can think of a few bookstores that do have sections divided by country. But for the most part, that's not the case, right? You just sort of throw everything together. I don't know, and I kind of wonder, is that the better way to do it? Or is it better to have a whole section of foreign fiction so that people... Although actually, and I should add that, interestingly, there is a kind of segregation between people who read foreign fiction, in part probably because of the way it's marketed, people who read foreign fiction and say, oh, Japanese fiction, I would never read that stuff. And people who read Japanese fiction but don't read foreign fiction at all. And this includes authors. There are many authors who write, they're writing fiction, but they'll never go to the section where their own books are being sold, right? They go and read foreign fiction.
I think it's time we reverse the flow, and so I'll start with Michael this time. What about translation from Japanese into other languages, and particularly English? Who gets to choose what gets translated? What can you say about the role of the translator and how that flow works?
So that's a very difficult question, because to answer a question like that, you need a sufficient sample size. And the sample size is way too small. I don't think you could actually say that there are any rules for how things get chosen. In my experience, it has been purely random. There are things that I really want to translate, and I go and I say, to a publisher, I'll meet an editor, I'd love to translate this. This is a wonderful book. Here's why, in this book, Nabokov appears as a character. It's intelligent. It is witty. It has a touch of science fiction, blah, blah, blah. It's wonderful. And this is the next, it's a combination of Borges and, I don't know, and I'll just, make up all these names. And it's also the next Murakami Haruki Murakami. And the editor will be really interested until he, sends an email. This is a true story. Sends an email to the publisher of the original Japanese book, and that publisher stupidly mentions that it's a novella in a collection of 2 novellas, and forget that. So I think it's really pretty random. You were saying earlier that somebody was saying that there's a kind of politics. Your friends were saying that there's a kind of politics to how things are. I don't think so. I don't think that there's enough of a brain behind the. So
it's not
the
intelligent design.
No, it's not intelligent design. It's just. It's not even design. It's just sort of mud tracks on the floor or something. Totally random and not. Yeah, you can't read it. Is my opinion, but I don't know.
Well, it's kind of reassuring that a culture with such relative prominence as Japanese does it randomly as well. It's kind of reassuring. In Singapore, what gets translated is whatever the National Arts Council will support with their fairly generous translation grants. Okay, that's slightly tongue-in-cheek because they're standing at the back, and I have to say that. But there's been a recent resurgence, I would say, of translation just done because writers usually come across a piece of writing by a peer or even someone more senior from Singapore or from another country, writing in a different language. And I think this has only become possible again. This happened a lot in the 50s, 60s, when everyone in Malaya was essentially multilingual. Died out for a little bit, and the generation today of Singaporeans who are in their 40s and below, 30s, 40s, and even their 20s, have been brought up in an education system that essentially means we're all effectively bilingual readers, at least. And this has meant that many writers are now able to read their counterparts in the different languages and inevitably fall in love with some of them and have started to try their hand at translation. In the past 5-10 years, quite a few of the translations coming up have been a result of that. And it isn't always from within Singapore. It's some, Jeremy Tiang has translated a novel by a Chinese author, The Promised Bird, and I think she's showing up in the UK this year as well. And some of these cross-frontier efforts, I think, are quite interesting. So there's a lot of stuff coming through Singapore. Might not be picked up by the major publishers necessarily in the UK and so on yet, but there's a lot of that effort. And I think it's quite interesting that because we have direct access to these multiple languages, that we're doing some of these for ourselves. One of the things that has been an offshoot of this is that, there are different flavors of languages. Even a language like Mandarin or Chinese, how it's used and spoken in Taipei might be different from how it's used and spoken in Beijing or Shanghai. There are regional variations, certainly for a language like Mandarin and Chinese. And for those who do commercial translation for your Nokia brochures or your Apple iPhone brochures and manuals like my niece who's doing some of that, they have long distinguished between the version of the instruction manual that goes to Beijing from the one that goes to Hong Kong, from the one that goes to Taipei, and it's all technically in Mandarin. That sort of awareness and consciousness of regional flavor or variation has only just started to creep back into literary translation. Before that, it's all, one size fits all. He's a professor in Chinese language, let him do it. But I think our readers have started to become more sensitive to the fact that there is value in getting someone who understands the particular dialect and flavor and idioms of that particular regional flavor and getting them to translate as well. So nowadays, if we were to pick up Singaporean Chinese text, it might be better, in fact, for someone who is Singaporean Chinese to translate that into English. Certainly, if it's a novel from Taipei, we would prefer translation from someone in Taipei rather than from someone in Beijing. Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, in terms of whether things are political about translations getting chosen, I don't think they're particularly like there's some kind of political behind-the-scenes machinations going on in the Korean context either. One thing to say is that traditionally there has been the idea of certain works or writers as representative of Korean culture. These ideas that there are some kind of essential elements that if a Korean work is going to be translated, that it should ideally contain these elements and be able to kind of educate the rest of the world about Korea. And the other kind of works that would be chosen would be those that were particularly socio-politically engaged with modern Korean history. And unfortunately, the vast majority of those which were translated sunk virtually without a trace, because the sad truth is that people are not interested in those kind of questions, generally speaking, outside of Korea. But what's particularly exciting in recent years, I mentioned earlier that there's this trend now of getting Korean literature translated into more minority languages. And for those initiatives, rather than the work being chosen simply by people looking at what's been written in Korean and thinking this must be translated, they're looking at the target language and the culture that they're being translated into and tailoring it much more specifically to what they think the readers in that country will want. For example, Vietnamese, I mentioned earlier, two Korean novels been translated into Vietnamese, Kim Young-ha's Quiz Show and Hangang the Vegetarian. And the reason that they were translated in the first place, the reason that anything was translated, is because of Hallyu, the Korean wave, and the incredible popularity that Korean culture has gained amongst Vietnamese people, but mainly amongst young people in Vietnam. These are dramas and K-pop and game shows that they're watching. And so there was a deliberate choice made to choose works that would appeal to younger readers, that were featuring, young people as characters, urban living, virtual reality, that kind of thing. And again, with Lithuanian that I mentioned as well, very different. One of those novels is The Republic of Zupis, which is a kind of invented Baltic republic, which, if you're Lithuanian, you recognize is based on Lithuania. And the other one by Imuniol, the name is The Lithuanian Women, which kind of says it all. And obviously those are pretty obvious choices to make to translate into those languages. But also what's really great is that those works exist in the first place. Korean literature is becoming so much more outward looking, so much more engaged with the rest of the world, far more so actually I would say than English literature, although that probably comes as no surprise to anyone. And there are all these kind of connections and flows being made that we in the UK and the US are not necessarily aware of at all. It's completely bypassing us, which is obviously sad for us because we want to read these great works as well. But at the same time, it's also great that English isn't really necessary for that these flows and connections can happen without the UK and the US market.
I think in the case of Chinese literature, and that's from all different areas of the Chinese-speaking world, I think that things have been changing quite a lot in the last few years, and I'm going to be cautiously optimistic that there's actually been a lot more energy within the publishing industry, within kind of recognized roles within publishing to promote Chinese literature, whether it's agents or editors making trips out to China, the kinds of within industry connections which are long established within Europe for translating between European languages. So I think this is a really great sign, a good step, and I think that is I think there are people who are really working on bringing Chinese literature into translation into other languages using those kinds of routes. So I think that's great. There's also if you do anything to do with Chinese literature at the moment, it becomes very obvious that the Chinese government is also incredibly keen for what they say for the culture to 走出去, to go out to the rest of the world. And I think that this is a positive thing. They would like people to understand China better, and novels, books, that's a great way to understand another culture. So the government is putting a lot of money and energy into this process. And I think that it's interesting because, of course, it's just the case with governments all over the world. The government's kind of aims and the way they spend money is not the same as how a publisher would spend money and invest in this process. So I think that it's a learning process for both sides. It's about trying to find a way how you cooperate without kind of by sort of strengthening internal industry mechanisms for finding publishers for books, not to work against them or kind of undermine them. So I think there's it's interesting the Chinese government are starting to invest in the translation and publication of books into English, Spanish, other languages, and have them published in China. So this is a kind of interesting phenomenon. I don't know whether this is a kind of slightly the growth of a kind of English or foreign language publication within China. This actually has kind of quite far-reaching implications potentially in the future in terms of, China, there's so many people learning English, publishing in English does make sense in many ways, it's starting to make sense in a Chinese context. But it's also, if these books are being translated in full, of course, that does make it easier for those books then to be published in other markets, because suddenly there are full translations. There are more people that read English or French or Spanish than read Chinese in the publishing industry elsewhere. So I think that it's definitely, I would say we're at a bit of a turning point. I feel like also one of the major thing I'd like to emphasize is that before, I think there was this idea of this category of Chinese literature, and that was, maybe you could walk into a bookshop, oh, there's the Chinese literature, where are the Chinese books? But I'm sure it's the same with Korean, with Japanese as well, that actually it's a great thing that once more books start getting translated, they get translated for being books in themselves, or for being maybe of a particular genre, or having a particular story to tell, not just because they're Chinese, or not because they just represent China. So I think that the agency I work for, we also represent Taiwanese authors, and that's the first time that an agency has been representing Taiwanese authors. So I think, you know, it's fun to be able to tell people this is a Taiwanese author and this is a Taiwanese crime novel. So it's, you know, it's not a story that's going to tell you about modern China. It's something else. And I think that I feel that with more and more people working to get more Chinese literature into other languages, I feel quite optimistic.
Thank you. I'm going to open up for questions in a minute. I just have one more area that we've touched on that I'd like the panel to explore, which is the role of English. English as a bridge language, the influence of the English language on other languages and on writing in other languages. Also, what you were talking about, translation of books into English within the country itself, and then how these books might be circulated, and how readers in other English language countries might also get to read these books. So if, do you have anything more to say about that, or?
I can do it like 1 minute, and then go 10 seconds. I think English continues to be extremely important for as a bridge language for Chinese literature abroad. It's absolutely clear that when you say to a publisher, yes, we've got a full English manuscript, they go, send it to me, I'll read it. When you say, I've got 10,000 words, I'm thinking, and if you say, I haven't got anything yet, forget it. So, of course, English is absolutely it's still incredibly important. And also, as a translator, I know that my translation of the first novel I did was used as a basis for the translation into other languages. And at the moment, for example, the Chinese grant that goes to publish Chinese books in other languages does not stipulate that the translation has to come from Chinese. It can come from another language. So at the moment, the reality is that that English especially continues to be extremely important for getting Chinese fiction, the translation of Chinese fiction into other languages, definitely. No one's ever contacted me to ask me any questions. It's just kind of happened, I think, with my implicit knowledge, not with my explicit knowledge, but it's definitely happens.
Well, I think that in the Korean context, although of course getting Korean works translated into English is seen as very important, I mean, mainly just because of the lack of what there is at the moment, I think it's also really encouraging to see all the instances in which English isn't needed. I recently, I was reading the Granta Best Spanish language novelists, and looking through their bios, 2 of them out of only maybe 15 had connections with Korea, because they'd been there either to festivals, literary festivals, or they'd been there on writers' retreats, and they'd then returned to their own countries as these incredible advocates for Korean literature, for getting them translated into Spanish, which is obviously going to result in a much sort of increased infrastructure and network there. More people will want to learn Korean, more people will be able to then translate Korean into Spanish without any need for English as a bridge language, and I think that will that sort of thing can also be replicated with other countries as well. There is a publishing house in Poland which specializes solely in translating Korean literature. It's impossible to imagine there being anything like that in England, but this was started by 2 graduates of the Korean Studies program at the University of Warsaw, just because they saw a gap in the market. They're not using English, they're translating from Korean directly into Polish. The majority of the works that they're translating haven't been translated into English yet. They've seen a gap in the market and they've gone for it. And I think that the UK and the US market needs to look at what these people are doing and really sort of take their cues from them.
I was just thinking that possibly 700,000 years ago, Chinese might have been a bridge language, certainly for the Asian region, since they were so dominant, and maybe that time will come again, give or take a couple of 100 years. Not yet. I think the reality of it is English is very much the link language. Certainly in Asia, with all its very diverse societies, it is one of the few languages we can use to speak to each other. And in a place like Singapore, it is the one language that links our different cultures together. We used to have a culture of translating between some of our other languages, Malay to Chinese, vice versa. Those skills have been lost for historical reasons. I won't go into some of them, political reasons. I think that reached, in my memory, its height in maybe the 60s and so on. And during the, right about the time we became independent. But those skills of being able to translate directly without using English have been lost. So we have had to resort to English very often as a bridge language between the different languages. But I'm kind of hoping that will come back. And one day we will be able to link the two great language communities of Asia, in India with all its diversity on one hand, China with all its diversity on the other, directly. Used to be the case. Maybe it'll come back. But in the meantime, English helps.
I was thinking as I was listening to everybody talk about Murakami Haruki Murakami, whose book, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, is kind of one of the most infamous instances of translation via English. So it was translated into English by J. Rubin and then translated from the English into German, and this was kind of a scandal. People thought this was awful. Murakami himself did not think it was awful. He was delighted that this happened. He wanted to have the book come out as quickly as possible, and I think there's something to be said for that. The interesting and ironic thing is that because Murakami has been so incredibly successful, this is just my impression, but my impression that is that he has actually, or his works have actually made it possible for people to translate his works, because people know they'll sell, into many, many languages that would not previously have been able to do that. Right? So you can have an Indonesian translation directly from the Japanese, not based on the English. So that at the same time that Murakami kind of stands out as one of the examples of, has at least this one work that is famous as a kind of scandal. Right? At the same time, his popularity has made it possible for there to be more translation that does not rely on English as a bridge language. So the importance of major best-selling authors is huge. Like if you get one of them, it can kind of sort of like water that manages to find a way through a lot of rock, and then gradually eats away and creates a channel. Best-selling authors can do that. At the same time, something really interesting. So that the book that was The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which was translated into German, when it was, one of the reasons this became kind of a scandal was that apparently the initial contract with Knopf, which published the book in English, stipulated that the book could not be longer than 500 pages, but in reality the book was longer than 500 pages, so it was shortened, it was condensed by about a third. And then it was translated from English into German, so the German translation was different too. Well, actually, Murakami liked the cuts, and J. Rubin, who's a very conscientious translator, he translated the whole thing, and then rather than let the editors cut it, he decided that he would do the cuts himself and consult with Murakami. So Murakami had approved it all. And Murakami he didn't just approve it in the English, he really approved the cuts and thought, this is terrific. And so the paperback version of The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle in Japanese has some of those cuts in it. So that, the result is that, English became a bridge between Japanese and Japanese there, right? And that's actually, I think, also really important that, and not only that, not only in the sense of an actual text being altered by the process of its translation and then coming back, in a different form into Japanese, but the way that Murakami is read, the extent to which he's being read, the sort of fever that surrounds, every year before, right before the Nobel Prize is announced, lots of critics and people I know will get, have newspapers saying just in case, please be ready to give us an interview at midnight after the Nobel Prize is announced, so that there's this kind of aura, right, that writers who've been translated into English and have been successful acquire, and I think that doesn't really happen with other languages to the same extent. So.
Yeah, that could lead us on to a whole new area about editing and translation. But I think we just have time for a couple of questions. Does anyone? Could you use the mic, please?
Hi. I've got a question for Michael Emmerich. Can you explain why Japan is relatively inactive in having its literature translated and promoted internationally?
I wish that I could, I wish that I could, or actually I wish I couldn't explain it but could stop it. Yeah, many of you, one of the topics we didn't really get into too much is, you know, the support that governments give to translation. Japan used to have, I mean, it sort of still does have, but doesn't really have, an organization called JLPP, the Japanese Literature Publishing, what is it? Japanese Literature Publishing Project, is it? Yeah. Which was cut by the government recently. And, you know, the whole process, I won't tell you the story because it's a very long and horrible story and everybody will, you know, be lying on the floor weeping at the end of it. It's a really sad story. I mean, it was, you know, the project had its flaws, but it was essentially, I mean, to cut a long story short, it was cut because there's this idiot who doesn't know how to use the internet. And he, you know, he went online, and so he's like, he uses this Japan Foundation database of translations and doesn't realize that it's giving you, the hits it gives you are not numbers of books, it's numbers of titles. So if, you know, you have a story that's published in an anthology, or say, okay, you have an anthology, that anthology will have, say it has 36 stories in it, each one of those 36 stories comes up as a hit, as, right? And then it's reprinted. So you get 36 more hits. It's printed in the UK, so you get 36 more hits. So this one book can have like 90 or 100 titles associated with it, right? And this guy who is on the advisory committee that cut this program got those things mixed up and said, every year we have 500 translations being published into English, when in fact the number is 13 or something like that, right? So stupidity, I suppose the short answer is the reason there isn't more. You know, the reason we don't have the kind of incredible stuff that KLIT, right, is doing. Wonderful. You know, your pamphlets are so well produced. They're beautiful. I wish the people were smarter in Japan.
But I mean, there's a flip side to that. I can imagine some governments would celebrate if there were so many titles being published, and would, you know, instead of cutting them.
Yeah, but well, yeah, okay. There's also a very sort of capitalist. Well, you know, why should if the market is taking care of it, why should the government get involved, right? Except, yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter anyway because they're just wrong. But, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for Anna. You were talking about the pull and the push factors. The Chinese government want to push the Chinese literature abroad, and the Western market want to attract Chinese authors, right? But we all know there's a kind of mismatch in what the Western market wants and what the Chinese can offer. There's a gap. So can you tell us something about where the gap is?
Okay, I'll try. I mean, yeah, there's a gap in terms of. I mean, of course, there's always still a sense in which part of the Western market has traditionally been interested in a kind of dissident angle or a banned angle or something. You know, it's been quite a heavy, I guess, political angle from the Western side. When I think it's very easy for everyone to talk about the political things involved in the Chinese government's push, but of course there's a equal kind of political thing going on in the pull as well, or has been. I think that nowadays, I mean, I think that that's lessening. I think that I hear far fewer editors say to me, oh, I want something, you know, by a dissident writer or something that's banned. In fact, I very rarely hear anyone ask for something like that. People say, oh, I want to know about how people live in China. I want to know what the real story is, or I want to know about what do young women who go from the countryside to the city, what are their lives like? Can you find me a book like that? So there are definitely, I think that from the Western side, the pull factors have changed a bit recently, which is great. I think that in terms of the push factors, obviously there are certain criteria that will always come from the Chinese side. Obviously, we're talking about different kinds of hierarchies of prestige and things that come on that side. And of course, you know, a writer that is incredibly popular, well respected, all of these things in China may not actually be the writer that resonates most in abroad. So I think that, of course, in there is a slight danger if some of these kind of programs for promoting, say, Chinese literature abroad come with a sort of pre-prescribed list of these are the ones we're going to support. Well, they might not be the ones that people want to read. So I think that I'm sort of positive that it's getting better, that this gap is getting smaller. But part of it is also just the thing that is intrinsically fascinating about working in translation rights as a business, whatever your language combination is, because it's just amazing to think, what is it, why is it that this book will do really well here and won't do well there, irrespective of these kind of more complex issues of kind of governments wading in and stuff. I think that there's also just something interesting about that gap, and that is the gap that is translation. That is the gap that is in every text. Every translation that is produced is dealing with that gap as well. And I think that is something that's really great. That's what's sort of great about the fact that we all speak different languages, is that we're always trying to navigate this thing that is our sameness and our difference. So in that respect, I think it's getting better. But I think that, yeah, obviously there is it's a sort of complicated thing to navigate. Sure.
I think we've run out of time, but that seems like a very positive note to end on. I would encourage you all to stay around. We have a networking event generously sponsored by the Nippon Foundation, so please join us for a glass of wine or juice and ask your questions informally and chat. But before that, please join me in thanking our panel, Michael, Alvin, Deborah and Anna.